Today I'm looking at infamous airplane hijackings from the 1970s, where the hijackers successfully parachuted out of the plane. These are all true stories. You can Google the details as we go along. But I'm more interested in what was not shared in the official reports, what eyewitnesses and victims shared later in their personal accounts. Some of these details literally made my skin crawl. Flight 305, 1971, the man with the parachute that inspired so many more. Sarah Chen had spent 15 years investigating cold cases for the Seattle Times, but something about Flight 305 kept pulling her back. Maybe it was the way her father, a former Northwest Orient mechanic, would fall silent whenever the case came up. Or perhaps it was the recurring nightmares she'd been having since discovering his personal logbook, hidden away in his belongings after his death last spring. A specific logbook entry from 1971 was different from the others. The normally precise handwriting was shaky, and there were dark spots on the page that could have been water damage. Tonight, on the 53rd anniversary of the hijacking, Sarah sat in her father's old workshop, surrounded by newspaper clippings and evidence photos. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows just as it had on that fateful night. Her father's logbook lay open before her, and for the first time she allowed herself to read the full entry. "I shouldn't write this down. They told us not to. But I need someone to know what really happened that night. What we found in the cargo hold after Flight 305 landed. What that man, Cooper, left behind." Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the page. Her father had never mentioned being involved in the investigation. The official records never listed him, but here was his account, written in trembling letters that grew more erratic with each line. The smell hit us first. That metallic tang that anyone who's worked around planes knows isn't normal. We thought it was hydraulic fluid at first, but it was something else, something worse. The account transported Sarah back to that night, seeing it through her father's eyes. November 24th, 1971, Portland International Airport. The man who called himself Dan Cooper settled into seat 18E, adjusting his dark suit and sunglasses with deliberate precision. The flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, noticed how his hands lingered on the briefcase in his lap, knuckles white against the black leather. "Bourbon and soda, please," he said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't quite place. As she turned away, she missed the way his eyes followed her, calculating, measuring the distance to the rear exit. At 3 p.m., Cooper handed Florence a note. She tucked it into her pocket without reading it, used to receiving phone numbers from business travelers. His voice stopped her cold. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a weapon." The words were spoken so softly that nearby passengers continued their conversations, unaware that their lives had just been pledged as collateral. Florence's training hadn't covered this. Nothing could prepare her for the absolute certainty in Cooper's voice, or the way he slowly opened his briefcase to reveal red cylinders nestled in a maze of wires. "I will demonstrate its effectiveness if necessary." The following hours unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Cooper's demands were precise: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a flight plan to Mexico City. But it was his behavior that haunted the crew, the methodical way he drank his bourbon, the careful attention he paid to the weather reports, the way he seemed to know exactly how much fuel they would need. As darkness fell and the passengers were evacuated in Seattle, Cooper's true nature began to emerge. First Officer William Radachak noticed how Cooper's hand occasionally twitched toward his collar, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. How he would stare out the window with an expression that bordered on hunger. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Radachak asked during the refueling. Cooper's smile never reached his eyes. "Let's just say I know what happens to men who jump into darkness." The flight resumed with a skeleton crew. Cooper had them fly at exactly 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down and the flaps at 15 degrees. The cabin was unpressurized, and the wind screamed through the plane like a banshee, drowning out everything but the pounding of their fires. At 8:13 p.m., a light on the control panel began to flash. The rear cargo door had been opened. The pressure change sucked papers throughout the cabin, creating a blizzard. When it cleared, Cooper was gone. But that's where the official story ends, and where Sarah's father's account truly begins. The maintenance inspection after landing was supposed to be routine, just checking for structural damage from the depressurization. But when we opened the cargo hold, we found something that never made it into the official report. Sarah's hands shook as she read on. There were scratch marks on the inside of the cargo hold. deep gouges in the metal, like something or someone had tried to claw at things to get a grip. And there was blood, not much, just a few drops, but enough to tell a story about what happens when you jump into darkness at 200 miles per hour in freezing rain, with equipment you don't fully understand. The next day they sealed the records and told us there was nothing out of the ordinary. The logbook also mentioned how they found Cooper's tie clip wedged in a corner of the cargo hold, bent and covered in frost. Sarah closed the logbook, her mind racing. The official reports never mentioned any inspection of the cargo hold, but as she crossed her father's account with weather data and flight records, pieces began falling into place. The unexplained radar contacts that had followed Flight 305 after Cooper's jump, the mysterious radio interference that had plagued the search efforts, the fact that 9 years later, when Brian Ingram found some of the ransom money on the banks of the Columbia River, the bills were arranged in an unnaturally precise pattern. Sarah remembered a related story about a hiker near Ariel, Washington, who had reported seeing an injured man with a briefcase on their hiking trail, refusing to accept help. Some reports suggested he matched Cooper's description. She looked back at her father's logbook, at the final entry. "I've tracked the pattern of Cooper's sightings over the years. They always happen on nights like the original. Bad weather, low visibility. But here's what keeps me awake. In every sighting, he's described exactly as he was in 1971. Same suit, same sunglasses, same tie clip that I found in the cargo hold. Some say D.B. Cooper died that night in 1971. Others believe he escaped with the money and lived out his days in anonymous luxury. I don't think Cooper survived that jump, but I don't think he died either. I think he found something worse than death out there in the darkness." Sarah closed the logbook and turned off her desk lamp. In the darkness, she could almost convince herself that the scratching sound coming from her father's old toolbox was just her imagination. Almost. Flight 119, 1972. The man in the lounge that brought down a plane. I've spent the last 50 years trying to convince myself that what happened that night at Lambert Field was just stress-induced paranoia, that the whispers I heard weren't real, that the shadows I saw moving against natural law were just tricks of exhaustion and fear. But now, as I sit in my nursing home watching another aeroplane hijacking on the news, I feel compelled to tell my story. Maybe then, someone will understand why I did what I did. It was June 1972, and I'd been stuck at Lambert Field in St. Louis for nearly 18 hours. A series of mechanical delays had left me stranded, forced to watch an endless parade of travelers flowing past like a river of lost souls. The airport seemed different after dark, too bright in some places, too dark in others, with shadows that didn't quite match the objects casting them. I was nursing my fourth scotch in the airport lounge when the first news bulletin flashed across the television screen. American Airlines Flight 119 had been hijacked on the tarmac. The perpetrator called himself Robert Wilson, though that name would later prove as false as everything else about him. He'd brought what looked like a trombone case aboard, a detail that made my skin crawl, because I distinctly remembered seeing a man with such a case earlier that day. But it wasn't the case that haunted me, it was his eyes. I hadn't noticed them when he walked past me that morning, but now, trying to recall his face, I remembered something wrong about them, something that made my mind skitter away, like a frightened animal. The news anchor's voice droned on about this being the 8th hijacking since D.B. Cooper's infamous skyjacking last year. 8 hijackings. The number echoed in my head, taking on an almost ritualistic significance. In ancient numerology, 8 represents cosmic balance, the point between earthly and divine, between reality and something else. Through the lounge windows, I could see Flight 119 sitting on the tarmac, illuminated by harsh floodlights that created a perfect circle of brightness around it. The FBI agents approached, disguised as airline officials, carrying bags containing the hijackers' bizarre demands. $502,500 in cash, such a specific amount, and 5 parachutes. 5, not 1, not 2, 5. That's when I started noticing other things. The way the shadows beneath the plane seemed to move against the wind. The way the air around the aircraft appeared to ripple, like heat waves on a summer road, except it was a cool night. And the whispers. God help me, the whispers. At first I thought it was just other passengers in the lounge discussing the situation, but these voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, speaking in a language that hurt my ears to hear. They grew louder whenever I looked at the plane, as if trying to tell me something. 91 passengers had been released, but one flight attendant remained inside with Wilson. The number struck me again, 91. 13 times 7. Another number heavy with hidden mystical meaning. Was I going mad, seeing patterns where none existed? Something snapped inside my mind. The weight of watching, of being another passive observer, became unbearable. My Cadillac sat in the short-term parking lot, a 3-ton mass of Detroit steel. I knew the layout of the airport, knew where the security gates were the weakest. I could end this, not with a gun or a badge or a clever plan, but with simple, brutal physics. The decision crystallized with terrifying clarity. Later, investigators would ask me about my reasoning, my motivation, my state of mind. How could I explain that I wasn't trying to stop a hijacking? I was trying to stop something worse, something that was using these hijackings as cover for what? Even now, I'm not sure. Each step toward the parking lot felt like walking through deep water. The air had grown thick, resistant. The whispers followed me, more urgent now. My car key was freezing cold in my palm, despite the warm June night. The engine's roar seemed to harmonize with those otherworldly voices, creating a symphony of madness. The security gate appeared in my headlights. Beyond it lay the runway, the plane, and whoever was pretending to be Robert Wilson. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Running over the gate was the easy part. Then the plane grew larger, more solid, more real. The impact came with a sound that wasn't entirely mechanical. Part screech of metal, part inhuman shriek. The world tilted sideways, and through the shattered windshield, I saw the plane's landing gear buckle under my Cadillac's impact. In the chaos that followed, Wilson was forced to transfer to another aircraft. His carefully laid plans began to unravel, though I, fighting for consciousness in the wreckage of my car, couldn't have known this. Couldn't have known that he would eventually parachute into the Indiana night, losing both his stolen fortune and his weapon in the darkness. Couldn't have known that farmer Lowell Elliott would find the money scattered across his field, or that another farmer, Ronald Miller, would stumble upon the abandoned submachine gun. The man calling himself Robert Wilson would be identified as Martin J. McNally, a former Navy sailor from Detroit, and he would be apprehended with just $13 in his pocket. A perfectly normal explanation for everything that happened. Almost too perfect, like a hastily constructed facade hiding something far more terrible. I spent 3 months in the hospital recovering from my injuries. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. The FBI agents who interviewed me seemed satisfied with my explanation of temporary insanity brought on by stress and alcohol. They never asked about the whispers or the shadows, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, and when I watch the news coverage of modern airplane hijackings, I look carefully at the shadows. I count the numbers in their demands. I watch for patterns that shouldn't be there. Flight 175, 1972, the copycat jumper. The America's Hotel's night clerk would later tell FBI agents that the man who checked in as George Ames carried himself like old money. Tailor suit, manicured nails, and a quiet confidence that commanded respect without asking for it. But there was something in his eyes that the clerk couldn't quite place. Something that made him want to look away whenever their gazes met. What the clerk didn't see was what happened after Ames returned to room 412. How he methodically laid out the contents of his briefcase on the bed, a handgun and a stack of newspaper clippings about D.B. Cooper's successful hijacking just 6 months earlier. Frederick William Hahnemann, for that was his real name, stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. The face that stared back at him wasn't the same one that had graced corporate boardrooms just 2 years ago. The eyes were harder now, haunted by the ghosts of failed ventures and mounting debts. He'd spent months planning this, studying every detail of Cooper's hijacking, determined to succeed where others had failed. "You can do this," he whispered to his reflection. "One flight, one jump, freedom." He didn't know then how wrong he was about the freedom part. Carol Matthews had been flying with Eastern Airlines for 7 years, but something felt off about Flight 175 from the moment she stepped onto the tarmac. The May morning was unusually cold for Allentown, with a heavy fog that seemed to swallow the aircraft's wings. As she completed her pre-flight checks, a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The businessman in 14C caught her attention during boarding. He was too well dressed for a morning flight to Miami, his suit pressed too perfectly, his shoes shined too brightly. He kept checking his watch, an expensive Rolex that caught the cabin lights, and touching the briefcase in his lap as if reassuring himself it was still there. 30 minutes into the flight, he handed her a note. Her training had covered this scenario, but nothing could have prepared her for the ice that formed in her stomach as she read the carefully typed words. "I have a gun and an explosive, no heroes. Tell the captain to land at Dulles instead of National. I want $303,000 in cash, 6 parachutes, 2 bush knives, 2 jumpsuits, 2 crash helmets. You have 3 hours. Don't test me." What happened next would replay in Carol's nightmares for years to come. The way Hahnemann's cultured voice never wavered as he issued commands. How he would occasionally close his eyes and mouth numbers to himself like he was counting down to something only he could see. The peculiar care he took in examining each parachute when they landed at Dulles, running his fingers along the seams as if reading a story in the stitching. But it was what happened in New Orleans that would haunt her the most. The first plane had developed mechanical issues, or so they were told. Carol had seen the look of barely contained panic in Hahnemann's eyes when the captain announced they needed to land. He'd insisted on watching as they transferred to the second aircraft, his gun never wavering, but his composure cracking just enough to reveal something beneath the sophisticated facade. "They're watching," he'd muttered, eyes darting to the darkness beyond the floodlights. "They're always watching." In the new plane, flying over Honduras, Hahnemann's behavior became increasingly erratic. He kept pressing his face against the window, staring into the void outside with an intensity that made Carol's skin crawl. The medications he'd been taking, motion sickness pills, he'd claimed, seemed to be wearing off, and his hands had developed a subtle tremor. "Do you want to know why I chose this flight?" he asked Carol suddenly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "He showed me. Cooper showed me." Before Carol could respond, Hahnemann stood up, clutching his briefcase of money like a shield. "They're calling now. Can't you hear them? The ones who jumped before?" With movements that seemed almost choreographed, he donned the parachute and moved to the rear door. The wind howled through the cabin as he opened it, but Carol would later swear she heard him laughing. A high, broken sound that didn't belong to the sophisticated businessman who had boarded in Allentown. "Tell them," he shouted over the wind. "Tell them I figured it out. The sky isn't empty." Then he was gone. 28 days later, FBI agent Sarah Kendrick sat across from a broken man in the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa. Hahnemann's expensive suit had been replaced by dirty local clothing, his manicured nails cracked and caked with dirt, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They never stopped moving, scanning the corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Are you ready to tell me what happened after you jumped?" she asked, recording device at the ready. Hahnemann's laugh was bitter. "Would you believe me if I did? Try me," she said. He leaned forward, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. "The darkness out there, it's alive. When you fall through it, it shows you things. Things that have always been there, watching us, following us. Cooper knew. That's why he chose the numbers he did. The altitude, the speed, the coordinates, they're all part of a pattern. What pattern? A door. Hallahan's voice dropped to a whisper. We thought we were opening the sky to escape, but we were opening something else, something that's been waiting. I spent 28 days hiding, but not from your manhunt. There are worse things in the darkness than federal agents. The money, she pressed. What happened to the money? His eyes finally met hers, and the terror she saw there was absolute. My associates from the east took it, all of it. Agent Kendrick switched off the recorder. What happened next never made it into the official report. How Hahnemann broke down crying, babbling about shadows that moved against the wind and voices that called his name in Cooper's voice. How he begged to be locked away, somewhere bright, somewhere high above the ground. They granted his wish. Frederick William Hahnemann spent the next 12 years in federal prison, always requesting cells on the highest floors available. He never talked about the hijacking again, but the guards would often find him pressed against the windows at night, watching the sky with desperate intensity.